Write the story now. Let me make sure all names are completely new and different from the prohibited list. The day my granddaughter cried at the Thanksgiving table, I didn't say a word. I just stood up quietly, walked out to the back porch, and made a phone call. My son in law's mother had no idea, not a single clue about who she had just made an enemy of. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning. My name is Howard Callahan. I'm 67 years old. I spent 41 years as a federal contractor compliance officer, essentially the person companies call when they need to know if their government contracts are clean, and the person the Department of Justice calls when they're not. I retired 4 years ago quietly. I didn't throw a party. I didn't hang a plaque. I told my daughter the same thing I told her for most of her life, that I worked in government consulting, which was true, just not the whole picture. My daughter Nora is 34. She has a mother's eyes, warm and a little too trusting. And she has always believed the best in people, sometimes long after the evidence said otherwise. Her mother, my wife Elaine, passed 8 years ago from ovarian cancer. It was the worst thing that ever happened to our family, and I won't pretend otherwise. Nora and I got through it the way the two of us got through most things, quietly together without making a production of our grief. After Elaine died, I made a decision. I had spent decades in a world where information was leverage and leverage was power. I didn't want Nora growing up with that weight on her. I wanted her to make friends because of who she was, not because of what her father could do. I wanted her to fall in love with someone who loved her for herself. So I kept my professional life close to the chest. Government consulting was enough. She never pushed, and I never explained. That might have been a mistake. I see that now. Nora met her husband, Elliot Marsh, 6 years ago at a fundraiser in Nashville. He was charming, well-dressed, and came from what his mother would describe, loudly and at every opportunity, as old Tennessee money. Elliot worked for his family's commercial real estate development firm, Marsh & Associates, which had been doing business in the Nashville area for 3 generations. He was polite to me at first, attentive to Nora. I gave him the benefit of the doubt the way any father does when his daughter looks at a man, the way Nora looked at Elliot. They married 2 years later. My granddaughter Poppy was born 11 months after the wedding. Poppy is 4 years old now. She has Elaine's same warm eyes and Nora's same tendency to assume everyone around her is a friend, until proven otherwise. She talks to strangers in grocery stores. She picks dandelions and hands them to people she's just met. She is, without exaggeration, the best thing in my life since I lost her grandmother. Elliot's mother, Poppy's other grandmother, is a woman named Vivienne Marsh. I want to be precise when I describe Vivienne, because I think accuracy matters. She is not simply unpleasant. Plenty of people are unpleasant and you manage. Vivienne is something more specific. She is a woman who has spent 63 years constructing a version of herself that requires other people to be lesser in order to remain standing. Her money, her name, her social position in Nashville resort guard circles. These are not things she simply has. They are things she wields, constantly, with the particular precision of someone who has practiced for decades. She made her feelings about Nora clear before the wedding, not in any one dramatic statement. In the small ways, the way she described Nora to her friends, Elliot's little schoolteacher girlfriend, as though teaching 4th grade was something slightly embarrassing. The way she'd glance at Nora's clothes at family dinners with an expression she didn't bother to hide. The way she'd redirect conversations at the table so that Nora's contributions simply dissolved. Vivian never raised her voice. She never had to. After Poppy was born, it got worse. Vivian had very specific ideas about how children should be raised, what they should eat, how they should speak, when they should be seen and when they should be quiet. None of these ideas were ever presented as suggestions. They were edicts, delivered with the absolute confidence of a woman who had never once in her adult life been seriously contradicted. Nora tried. I watched my daughter bend herself into shapes no person should have to bend into, trying to be the daughter-in-law Vivian could approve of. She adjusted the way she dressed Poppy. She changed how she talked about her own work. She stopped sharing opinions at dinner unless directly asked. I would watch her across the table at family gatherings. This woman I raised to be strong, to know her own mind, making herself smaller, and I would feel something low and steady burning in my chest that I didn't let show on my face. Elliot was not cruel to Nora. I want to be fair. But he was conflict avoidant in the way that men raised by dominating women sometimes become, reflexively appeasing, allergic to any friction with his mother, fundamentally unable to choose between his wife's dignity and his mother's approval. When Vivian said something cutting to Nora, Elliot would change the subject. When Nora came to him privately and said something had hurt her, he would nod and say he'd handle it, and then not handle it. This is its own kind of cruelty, I know. It just wears a more comfortable face. The Thanksgiving in question was this past November. The gathering was held at Vivian's house. A sprawling colonial in Belmead that she never let anyone forget had been in the Marsh family for 40 years. There were about 15 people there, Vivian's sister and her husband, a couple of Elliot's cousins, some family friends I'd met once or twice. I was there because Nora had asked me to come, and because I would drive through a blizzard to spend a holiday with my daughter and my granddaughter. The trouble started before dinner. Poppy was playing in the hallway with two of the cousins' children. They were chasing each other, the way 4-year-olds do, laughing and shrieking with the unself-conscious joy of small children who don't yet know they're supposed to be quiet in certain houses. Vivian appeared at the end of the hallway, and her expression went flat in the way I had come to recognize. "What is this?" she said. Not to the children, to Nora, who was standing nearby. Nora said something gentle about. Nora said something gentle about the kids just playing, that she'd settle them down. "I've told Elliot," Vivian said, still looking at Nora, "that children need to understand boundaries, especially in this house." Nora called Poppy over and spoke to her quietly. Poppy, being 4, nodded very seriously and then 30 seconds later was giggling again. Children are not furniture. They do not hold still because an adult has decided the room requires stillness. Dinner was better for a while. I sat near the end of the table and watched and said little. I've spent enough years in rooms where the real dynamics operate just below the surface of polite conversation to know when something is building. Vivian was in a particular mood. I'd seen it before, a kind of cold quality, like she was waiting for something she could correct. It came toward the end of the meal. Poppy, who had been sitting between Nora and me, reached across the table for the bread basket and knocked over her cup of apple juice. It hit the white tablecloth and spread fast, the way spilled juice always does, and Poppy's face crumpled immediately into the particular expression of a small child who knows something has gone wrong and isn't sure how bad it's going to be. Nora was already up, reaching for her napkin. Vivian moved faster. She came around the end of the table. I still don't know exactly when she stood up. And before Nora could reach Poppy, Vivian grabbed my granddaughter's upper arm and swatted her, hard, on the back of her hand. Not a tapper, not a gentle correction. A deliberate, sharp smack that made Poppy gasp and then begin to cry, in that heartbroken way. Children cry when they're more confused than hurt, when the world has done something they don't have the framework to process yet. "That is my grandmother's tablecloth," Vivian said. Her voice was ice. "You do not grab, you ask." The table went completely silent. I looked at Elliot. Elliot looked at the tablecloth. "Mom's right," he said quietly. "She needs to learn. I have been in difficult rooms. I have been in difficult rooms. I have been in depositions where careers ended. I have been in Federal Review hearings where the air itself seemed to understand the gravity of what was happening. I have sat across tables from contractors who lied to the government and watched them realize, too late, that the man across from them had already documented everything they thought was hidden. I know how to keep my face still." I pushed back my chair. I placed my napkin on the table. I said at a normal volume, "Excuse me for a moment." And I walked through the kitchen and out the back door onto Vivian's flagstone patio. It was November. Cold. The air tasted like wood smoke and approaching winter. And I stood there for a moment with my hands in my jacket pockets, feeling my heartbeat settle from whatever it had been doing back at that table. Then I took out my phone and called a man named Clifton Clay. Clifton and I had worked together years ago when he was with the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, and I was consulting on a contractor audit that had developed into a broader investigation. We had stayed in touch the way people do when they've been through something that mattered. He'd moved into private practice about 6 years ago, compliance consulting mostly, with a firm that worked closely with federal and state agencies. He knew people. More importantly, he knew how things worked. I told him what had just happened to Poppy. I told him calmly. Then I told him that for the past 2 years, I had been noticing things about the way Marsh and Associates conducted certain aspects of their business. Things I had noticed the way a man who spent 41 years in compliance notices things, involuntarily. The way you can't stop reading a page even when you want to. Inconsistencies in the way that federal contract disclosures were filed. Subcontractor arrangements that had the particular shape of arrangements designed to obscure beneficial ownership. A property transaction from 3 years ago involving a municipal development contract that had a very specific smell I had encountered before, twice, in my career, and both times it had ended in federal charges. I hadn't done anything with these observations because they were observations. Because Elliot was my son in law, and I had chosen not to involve myself. Because I am not a man who uses what he knows as a first resort. But Clifton had the resources to find out if my observations were correct. And he had the relationships to make sure that if they were correct, the information reached the right people without it ever looking like it came from a 67-year-old retired man with a grievance. I told Clifton I'd like to find out if what I suspected was actually there. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Howard, why didn't you call me about this 2 years ago?" I said, "Because I was hoping I wouldn't have to." I went back inside. I found Nora in the downstairs bathroom with Poppy, who had stopped crying and was listening to her mother tell her a story about a princess who spilled grape juice at a royal banquet, and it turned out fine. I knocked softly. Nora opened the door. Her eyes were bright in the way eyes get when someone has been working hard not to cry. I didn't say anything dramatic. I just said, "I've handled it." She looked at me the way she looked at me after her mother's funeral. Like she wanted to ask what that meant, but also, on some level, already trusted the answer. We went home early that night. Over the next 6 weeks, I learned that my observations had been more than observations. Marsh and Associates had been misclassifying subcontractors on federal projects for at least 7 years. A practice that, in the context of their government contracts, constituted fraudulent billing. The municipal deal I noticed was worse. It involved a city council member, a rezoning approval that should have been public, and a financial arrangement that was, in the unambiguous terminology of federal law, a bribe. I did not do this myself. I want to be clear. I made one phone call. Clifton did what Clifton does. The information moved through channels that existed for exactly this purpose. By mid-January, the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation and the FBI's Nashville field office were looking at documents I had never personally touched. During those 6 weeks, I said nothing to Nora. I said nothing to Elliot. I attended one more family dinner, a Christmas gathering, and I sat at Vivian's table and watched her preside over the room with her customary authority, and I thought about 41 years of work. And I ate my turkey and smiled pleasantly when she said something barbed about Nora's contribution to the dessert table. Vivian was arrested on a Thursday morning in late February. Elliot called Nora an hour later from the parking lot of a Starbucks, crying in a way she later described to me as the first genuinely unguarded thing she had ever seen from him. He didn't know what to do. He kept saying that. He didn't know who to call, he didn't know what this meant, he didn't know what was real. Nora was gentle with him. She is her mother's daughter in the ways that matter most. The charges against Vivian included fraudulent billing on federal contracts, bribery of a public official, and conspiracy to commit wire fraud. The firm was placed under a compliance monitor, an arrangement I am familiar with from both sides of the table. Elliot, who had not been directly involved in the specific transactions under investigation, was not charged, though the family's finances were significantly restructured by what followed. The Marsh and Associates name, which Vivian had treated as a kind of personal crown, became the headline in 3 consecutive days of Nashville business news. I found out later that when Vivian was processed and appeared in court for her initial hearing, she wore a conservative blazer over a silk blouse. Her attorney was excellent, a criminal defense partner from a firm that charges rates I recognize from my consulting years. She made bail by end of day, but she stood in a courtroom in Nashville and heard charges read against her that used words like conspiracy and federal fraud. And the woman who had once smacked my granddaughter's hand for knocking over a cup of juice. The woman who ran her dinner table like a feudal court and made my daughter smaller every time she walked through the door, had to stand there and be very, very small herself. I'm not proud of enjoying that, but I would be lying if I said I didn't. The harder part came after, and I want to talk about it honestly, because I think it's the part that matters most. Elliot and Nora had real conversations for the first time in months. Without the gravitational pull of Vivian's presence organizing every interaction, without the constant low-grade anxiety of managing his mother's approval, Elliot started to actually show up. It was tentative at first. He apologized to Nora, not one of the reflexive, vague apologies he'd been offering for years. A real one, specific, where he named the things he'd failed to do. He said he was sorry for Thanksgiving. He said he was sorry for all the Thanksgivings. Nora, who was a better person than most, took him at his word. I had a conversation with Elliot myself about 3 weeks after the arrest. We went for coffee at a diner near their house. The kind of place with booths and real coffee cups and no one around to overhear. I didn't tell him how the investigation had started. I didn't tell him about the phone call on the patio. I want to be honest about why. Partly because it wasn't relevant to what we needed to talk about, and partly because I think some things a father does for his family don't require acknowledgement. They just need to be done. What I did tell him was this. I told him that his daughter, my granddaughter, deserved to grow up in a house where no one put their hands on her in anger, where her parents showed her by example what it looked like for a man to stand up for the people he loved. I told him that I had watched Nora make herself smaller in that house for 4 years and that I would not watch it happen for another 4. I told him I thought he was a better man than he'd been showing and that I was willing to be proven right about that. He didn't say much. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup and looked at the table for a long time. Then he said, "She told me once that she never knew exactly what you did for work. She always thought it was something quiet." I said, "It was." He looked up at me. I think he was putting something together. I let him. Nora called me a few days after that. It was late, past 9, and she started the conversation with small talk about Poppy. A funny thing Poppy had said at breakfast, a drawing she'd done at preschool. I know when my daughter is working up to something. I waited. She said, finally, "Dad, what do you actually do?" I was quiet for a moment. Then I told her, "Not everything. Some of it is still not mine to share publicly. But the shape of it. 41 years. Federal compliance. The kind of work that exists in the spaces between agencies, between what's official and what's necessary." She was silent for a long time. Then she said, "Is that what happened to Vivian?" I said, "I noticed some things. A long time ago. I looked into whether they were real." Another silence. "You made one phone call," she said. "I made one phone call," she said. "I made one phone call," she said. "I made one phone call." I heard her exhale. Not relief exactly. Something more complicated than that. The sound of a person recalibrating. Understanding something about the landscape they've been living in that they hadn't understood before. "I used to wonder," she said finally, "why you never, when things got bad, I used to wonder why you didn't do something, say something. You always just watched." I said, "I know." "Were you watching the whole time?" I said. "Yes." She was quiet again. Then, "I wish I'd known." I thought about that. I thought about all the reasons I'd kept it quiet. Wanting her to have a life that was hers, not defined by her father's reach, not complicated by knowing what I could or couldn't do in a given situation. I thought about whether I'd made the right call. All those years of government consulting and deliberate understatement. I said, "You're strong enough that you didn't need to know. But I want you to know now." She cried a little. I didn't say anything while she did, because some moments don't need filling. Before we hung up, she said, "Poppy asked me yesterday where Grandpa Howard went after dinner on Thanksgiving. She said you came back and you looked different." I asked what she told her. Nora said, "I told her Grandpa had to make an important phone call, but that everything was going to be okay." I said, "That was exactly right. Poppy is doing well. She started a new preschool this spring and she already has 3 best friends, 2 imaginary and 1 real. She draws pictures of our family that include everyone, Nora, Elliot, me, Elaine as a star in the corner. And she hands them out without ceremony, the way she hands dandelions to strangers. She is, at 4 years old, completely and wholly herself. That is the thing I was protecting, not just her safety in one moment at one dinner table. The light of that child to grow up whole. In a house where love isn't conditional on performance, where her mother hasn't been worn down to a version of herself that can barely be recognized. I hear Vivian's case is moving through the court system. Her attorney is good, as I said. These things take time. I have spent a career in the machinery of accountability, and I know it is slow and imperfect and sometimes insufficient. But it moves. I am 67 years old. I worked 41 years in rooms most people never know exist. I did it quietly and I did it well. And when I walked away, I thought I was done. Turns out, the one phone call that mattered most was the one I made on a cold November porch, with the smell of wood smoke in the air and my granddaughter's crying still fresh in my ears. I have no regrets about that call. Not one. People sometimes ask me if I regret waiting as long as I did. If I should have stepped in sooner, said something at one of those dinner tables, made a call 2 years earlier, put a stop to it before it ever got to that November afternoon. I've thought about that question more than I expected to. Here's what I keep coming back to: the way a person responds to a situation tells you exactly who they are, not who they claim to be, not the version of themselves they've constructed for dinner parties and family photos, who they actually are. Rivian spent decades building identity out of a family name, a house in Belmead, and the particular satisfaction of making other people feel small. That wasn't something I could have talked her out of. It wasn't something Nora could have outlasted through patience or grace or becoming a better version of herself. It was simply who Rivian had chosen to become, and the only real question was when the weight of those choices would catch up with her. It always does, not because the universe is keeping score in any mystical sense. I'm too old and too practical for that kind of thinking. It catches up because the same patterns that make a person capable of smacking a 4-year-old's hand at a dinner table are the same patterns that lead to 7 years of fraudulent billing on federal contracts. They come from the same place: the belief that rules are for other people, that your name protects you, that the people below you on whatever ladder you've constructed don't have the standing to push back. That's not just a character flaw, that's a liability. And eventually, liabilities come due. I think about Elliot too. He wasn't a bad man. I want to be fair about that, the same way I tried to be fair in that diner booth when we sat down with our coffee. He was a man who had been raised inside a system that rewarded compliance and punished friction, and he had adapted accordingly. The tragedy of that isn't the cruelty, it's the waste. All those years of watching his wife diminish and telling himself it wasn't his problem to solve. That's not strength, that's the absence of it. And I think some part of him knew that, which is why he cried in that Starbucks parking lot the way he did. The thing I try to pass on to Nora, and the thing I hope she passes on to Poppy, isn't power in the way Vivian understood it. It's not connections or leverage or knowing the right people. It's the quieter thing underneath all of that: the discipline to keep your head when something has hurt you badly, the integrity to act through the right channels instead of the satisfying ones, and the patience to trust that those two things together are enough. They usually are. I spent 41 years watching people who thought they were untouchable discover otherwise. Not because someone finally beat them at their own game, but because the choices they made accumulated quietly, in the dark, until there was simply too much weight for any reputation to hold. You don't have to outshout people like Vivian. You don't have to match their energy or their cruelty or their certainty. You just have to be precise and patient and willing to act when the moment actually requires it. Poppy handed me a drawing last week. Me, Nora, Elliot, and a small star in the corner she said was her other grandma, the one in heaven. She'd drawn all of us holding hands. I put it on my refrigerator, right at the center. That's what the phone call was for.